Thank you very much, dear Jacob. That was very generous of you. It is a great opportunity to be with you. It is always a fantastic opportunity to listening to Eric Garcetti, and listening him in these rough days, especially exciting. Well, the ambassador is not here, Leslie is not here, but thank you to the Los Angeles Business Council for this possibility. I see a lot of friends, and it's great to be here. I have to thank Mary Leslie, because she asked me to talk about the Mexican Constitution. I'm going to be talking about the economy and the challenges of a huge city as Mexico City in the next panel. But right now, I want to use this opportunity to talk specifically about the spirit of the Mexico City Constitution. I was talking about you, Mary. I feel it's necessary to begin this speech by drawing your attention to the political specificities of Mexico City. Mexico City, a huge city, no? If Mexico City would be a country, it would be the 6th largest economy in Latin America, including Mexico. It's larger than Peru or comparable to Colombia. It's 20% of Mexico's GDP. It's a huge city. And I also want to remark that when we talk about the city, it is not as LA or Chicago. Mexico City, it's considered an entity of the Federation. Within the Mexican concert, Mexico City is an anomaly because for a long time, almost a century and a half, it was drawn from a legal point of view, as if tracing paper were placed over the District of Columbia in the United States of America. Another thing we copy from the constitutional system of the US, a particular territory considered the seat of the federal powers. But since the Mexican Revolution, we went a little too far, because the result of the political turmoil, even from the early 20s, was that the inhabitants of the old city of Tenochtitlan were left without the possibility of choosing their local authorities. Many factors and historical rivalries are behind that design, but the fact is that for more than half a century, the Mexicans residing in the so-called federal district could not vote to choose their mayor or even their closest authorities. It was until 1996 that a big change happened. A political reform of great depth and consequences returned the status of full citizenship to the inhabitants of the federal district. And for the first time, local elections were held in which Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas won for the left and his own right the mayor's office. And since then, our huge city has been governed by left-wing mayors. But the historical difference between the District of Columbia is much more than political. Mexico City's demographic, urban, economic, and industrial tendencies are characteristic of a mega city that turn it into the most populous region in the Americas. And it has been since 700 years ago. The capital of the whole country, seat of the federal powers, and mega city that concentrates 22 million people on its metropolitan area, did not have a constitutional order, which made that a huge anomaly. I believe any citizen in North America can understand how odd this is, given the very dynamic and rich constitutional life that occurs at the subnational level, right here in California as well as in the rest of the states. how was it possible then that there was a federated entity which elected its major local congress and delegational authorities and yet did not have its own constitution? Well, this is the strange anomaly which was dissolved this year in Mexico City thanks to the tenacious work of Mayor Miguel Ángel Mancera, a pact, and a lot of politics made it possible for the capital of the country to draft, within an assembly elected for that unique purpose, the constitution of the city. And I have to say, Gabriel Cuadri is here. He was part of that constitutional assembly, and he did a terrific job. The result has been worth it. Let's take a closer look. Ours is a constitution that was thought especially for the inhabitants, the project, the government, and the future of a mega city. I believe that in Latin America, only Buenos Aires has gone through a similar experience. What this is all about is to establish a sort of roadmap for the development and sustainability of a city like Mexico City, even though it is sappy and oppositional. As a tribute to the great Marshall Berman, we can say that our is a developmental constitution with 9 major purposes: greater well-being of citizens, building basic structures for a universal welfare system, economic growth based on modern sectors, instruments for a subnational economic policy that contrasts with the national one, long-term ecological sustainability, modernization of urban infrastructure and logistics, new land use and fiscal regime, long-term planning structures, and structures for a genuine social dialogue. The idea that presides over the Constitution is to formulate the greater purpose of the city and the institutions that will make them possible, while at the same time displaying a clear differentiation from national economic model, which has dominated for over 30 years. The Constitution of Mexico City understands that economic activity is not only private, it's also a public good by itself, generalizing more modern production activities of greater value added, the increases of overall income and productivity. The boost to growth requires private and public investment without exclusion or prejudices. Private investment in the city that must be protected and accompanied by obligation of the authorities, investment that has essential legal certainties and that obtains sufficient incentive for its development. The Constitution understood that Mexico City cannot be conceived as a state that has reached its unsurmountable limits. Rather, like any modern city, it must be thought of a space in permanent renovation of its physical infrastructure. The Constituent Assembly discussed issues of great relevance to the city. Essentially, one of them, land use. The thesis launched by the government of Miguel Ángel Mancera is simple. The well-being of all must not be dependent on the use of land. Land use must be subjected to the welfare of all. It contains the seed to establish general and universal mechanisms of permanent income redistribution. And let me be clear, because I know the word redistribution in this country sometimes takes a lot of noise, but I'm going to be very firm about using the word in Mexican terms. But this income redistribution in the Constitution was formulated as rights. Another extremely important factor, the city will have a long-term public investment planning system that will ensure the permanent modernization of its infrastructure. It will establish public policies for a less polluting and less predatory economy, a policy of general sustainability, which implies not only the government actions, but all the economic activity of the city. Finally, and not to mention everything that is over there, the Constitution incorporates a metropolitan vision that will guide the design of coordination instruments at a mega scale, incorporating a view of the greater metropolitan area and its surroundings. Thus, the Constitution of Mexico City calls for building a whole battery of instruments in contrast to the dominant economic policy, precisely because it is developmentalist. Therefore, the city is the model we propose to the Mexican society to build growth alongside a more equitable and fair redistribution. The Constitution of Mexico City is interesting for other things, for its more functional and more modern architecture, and because it implies very important advances for public management. In other words, our regimes are called democratic because they are consecrated by the polls. But very often, the resulting governments do not rule in a democratic way, since their actions do not obey clearly established rules of transparency, accountability, or listening to citizens. That has happened in my country, even in my city, and I believe that from time to time in Washington too. But the main axis, what can be called the bone marrow of the Constitution, is rights. It is the first case in which a system of rights in line with human rights has not only materialized, but has also expanded, at least in national and international doctrine. The ancients called this social constitutionalism. It is not a question of everyone paddling his own canoe, but an explicit project of equalization based on universal rights and special rights for those who need it the most. Precepts related to what the Mexican scholar Antonio Azuela has called rights for body, joy, and death. If it were only for the explicit introduction of dignified and assisted death, or the recognition of unconventional forms of family, this Constitution should be recognized as a civilizing step in Latin America and probably even here in the States. There's no money for all those rights, we've been told. But from the outset, the Constitution says and clarifies that these are rights that would be progressively converted gradually in an active but obligatory process in which their own financing is built. As the great American jurists Stephen Holmes and Cass Sustain remind us, rights are costly. And as we aspire to be a civilized society, we must secure the resources that sustain them. My answer to this question has always been, can it be that we are avoiding generalizing rights just because we don't want to pay taxes? And what Jacob was saying, for me, it is very striking what is happening. Sorry, Ambassador, it's not politically correct for me to say that, but it is very striking to be the advances that you had in health. Well, health is not a privilege, it's a right, but that's another story. All of this does not mean that the city government, our mayor, Miguel Ángel Mancera, the people that participate in the Constitutional Assembly, the Constitution itself, candidly suppose that law automatically creates society. What we do believe is that it will be a vehicle to think and define it, and to that extent, to generate an effect over the society itself and the economy of the city. The introduction of a full chapter of the right to the city points in that direction and follow the steps of the state of California and this outstanding city of Los Angeles. It includes a section for the protection of migrants and people subject to international protection. The core point is that the city aims to provide hospitality, human treatment, and guarantee rights to people who are there in transit, refugees, or in uncertain legal condition. Precisely in our times, as Mayor Gassetti was saying, this is especially relevant. A little bit more than a year and a half ago, the New York Times sum up the spirit of our time in its headline, "Who is fear today?" The editors ask if terrorism was still the main source of our panic, as it has been in the second years after 9/11, or if we have already identified other elements to continue to nurture our inner fears. The article conclusion was that, in a certain way, contemporary people need to be anchored by some fear of any kind, because they cannot walk without their own well-oiled fears. The fact is, if you see the France election, if you see the recent election here in the US, that immigrants are today one of the incarnations of the fear that many need to subsist, to walk on the street, or simply to make highly demagogic politics. I insist, always from fear and probably anger. It takes the courage of California or the determination of Los Angeles so that this widespread sensitivity does not take on the character of an era or an epoch, but is reverted and seen as a difficult passage, yes, but transitory and of firm resistance. I remember that in one of the best books I ever read, The History of the Greek Spirit, authored by the German philosopher and historian persecuted by the Nazis, Wilhelm Nestle, I found a passage that seems to have been written by a futurist or someone narrating our own time. In this passage, with portraits, Greek world of the 6th century before Christ, reference is made to a demographic explosion, to massive emigration, to increased communication between countries, to a systemic fear, and to a moral environment characterized by the general disappearance of piety. Please let me know if because the sense of piety for me is piedad, piety. In recent months, the insistence of the German scholar in this binomial resounds in my head: presence of fear and absence of piety. I remember that book this week when I saw a photograph in the newspaper El País last Tuesday. A wall open between San Diego and Tijuana, so that for 3 minutes, under surveillance to assure that no one crossed the borderline, Mexicans living here could see, touch, and cry with their relatives whom they have not seen for many years. A little piety doesn't hurt anyone. This is what the Californian NGO that reached this agreement of pure humanity with the United States Border Patrol seems to tell us. Mexican relatives did not say much, but an I love you gives strength to the soul for upcoming years of absence and hard, honest work. Fear, our historian believes that the texts from the period before Pericles denote a disturbing atmosphere of threats and are not always justified by what was really happening. I mean, the ancients also lived their own periods of post-truth or fake news. That society seemed to be gripped by disturbing signs, although, as far as we know, without being perfect, it enjoyed considerable prosperity and achieved an outstanding organizational and technological capacity, just as America nowadays. However, wealth, mercantile navigation, scientific and artistic takeoff, and prolonged periods of peace were not enough to ward off the sinister signals that, judging by the testimonies still preserved, burst onto the stage in the form of bad omens and dark oracles. If Nestle is right, the man of those times could not only overcome one fear when they had already adopted another. Is it that will happen to us? Are we in an unstoppable race of national fears that jump from racial to religious to economic? Some exist to replace the other. I read the news from here and there, and it seems that the world is traversed today by the ghost of impiety, by evil people who are aware of their own evil. Because for too many citizens in the world, solidarity, inclusiveness, minimal piety have ceased to be part of the human puzzle. Well, the Constitution of Mexico City has been born explicitly against this phantom. It has not allowed itself to be crushed by that vision, by the interest that suggests to abandon utopianism, the escalation of unachievable rights, and of course, the warnings about how expensive solidarity comes out to be. This mixture of fear and lack of piety in the 6th century before our era, however, did not prevent the advent of a splendid age, which, despite many hardships, welcomed democracy, logic, mathematics, science, classical art, and philosophy. The Greek tragedy, the fear of that time was battled by catharsis, when compassion, solidarity, and hospitality were cultivated as the highest bonds that unite citizens and people, in short terms, human beings. Dear all, it is deeply consoling to me to think that also with those values, with agreements like the new Mexico City Constitution, with examples as the Year of Mexico in Los Angeles, and as this forum, or with small but meaningful compromises such as the one of the California NGO, we may, perhaps soon, find an exit, a similar bridge between the past and our time. Podamos, quizá pronto, encontrar una salida, un puente similar entre aquel pasado y nuestro tiempo. Muchísimas gracias.